Tonight, FBI and ICE raid twin Somali judges, 9.64 tons of heroin seized, $4.8 billion fraud uncovered.
Federal agents executed simultaneous raids across Minneapolis and St. Paul that dismantled one of the most audacious infiltration schemes ever documented on American soil. Two sitting federal judges. Nearly 10 tons of heroin, $4.8 billion in laundered funds. And a criminal network so deeply embedded in our judiciary that honest officers didn't know who to trust anymore. That is where this story begins. But understand, what you are about to hear did not start in a courtroom. It started in darkness, in back alleys, in the kind of desperation that makes a person willing to trade their oath for a briefcase full of cash. The Minneapolis St. Paul corridor had been bleeding heroin for years. Neighborhoods rotting from the inside. Overdose deaths climbing. Hospital emergency rooms flooded every single night with addiction cases. But nobody was asking the right question. Nobody was connecting the dots between the carnage on the streets and the men in black robes sitting high above it all. It was 3:47 in the morning when the first team moved. The streets of downtown Minneapolis were dead silent. Snow had fallen 2 days before and hadn't melted. Everything was frozen and white and empty. The kind of quiet you only get in the deep hours before dawn when even the city's nightlife has gone to sleep. Streetlights cast pale yellow circles on the pavement. The air was bitingly cold, around 9 degrees. The kind of cold that makes your lungs hurt when you breathe. A convoy of black unmarked vans turned onto Marquette Avenue without headlights. FBI SWAT teams emerged from those vehicles like tactical shadows. Kevlar vests, rifles, night vision goggles, comms units crackling with coded language. 12 agents moving in perfect synchronization, their boots silent on the frozen concrete. One unit peeled toward a 7-story federal courthouse annex. Another group moved to a residential loft building 3 blocks away. A third team was already positioning at a warehouse district near the Stone Arch Bridge. They were not hunting street dealers or mid-level distributors. They were hunting judges. At 3:52 a.m., the first breach door exploded inward. Flashbangs detonated inside the loft apartment of federal judge Marcus Thornfield, age 64, married twice, decorated jurist with 22 years on the bench. He woke to screaming agents, weapons raised, his bedroom door kicked clean off its hinges. His wife started screaming. His hands were up before his eyes were even open. Simultaneously, across the city in St. Paul, another SWAT team was breaching the residence of federal judge David Ashford, age 61, divorced, known for his harsh sentencing records on drug cases. Except Judge Ashford was not home. The agents found him 3 hours later trying to cross into Canada near the Pigeon River crossing. He was arrested without incident at a gas station in International Falls. In his vehicle they found 3 encrypted hard drives, a burner phone with no SIM card, and $470,000 in cash bundled in a duffel bag under the passenger seat. But the real operation was not at their homes. At 3:58 a.m., federal agents using heavy cutting equipment broke through the reinforced steel door of Unit 4012 at the North Star Industrial Complex, a nondescript warehouse building that had been operating under the shell company name Northern Logistics Solutions LLC for the previous 4 years. Inside, they found something that would reshape the entire investigation. The space was a drug fortress. Vacuum-sealed packages of heroin sat stacked on industrial shelving units reaching toward a 20-foot ceiling. The DEA agents began counting immediately, package after package, kilogram after kilogram. The heroin was so pure, so densely packed, that even touching the bags risked accidental absorption. Respiratory masks went on every single officer. This was not street-level product. This was pharmaceutical-grade heroin destined for bulk distribution across the upper Midwest. The numbers kept climbing. 5 tons, 6 tons, 7 tons, 8 tons. By the time the final count was complete, federal agents had seized 9.64 tons of heroin from that single warehouse. 9,640 kilograms of one of the deadliest substances known to human chemistry. The street value was estimated at $480 million. But that was only the beginning. In another corner of that same warehouse, ICE agents discovered something that made them go cold. Hidden behind a false wall lined with lead shielding, the kind designed to block radio signals and thermal imaging, was a command center. 3 servers, 4 high-end workstations, encrypted phones, satellite uplinks, and documents. Thousands of documents, financial ledgers, encrypted communication logs, and photographs. Dozens of photographs. One photograph showed Judge Marcus Thornfield standing next to a man the DEA would later identify as Viktor Morozov, a known lieutenant in the Solaris cartel, a transnational organized crime syndicate with operations spanning Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and increasingly the American heartland. Another photograph showed Judge David Ashford at what appeared to be a private dinner with a woman identified as Natasha Volkova, Morozov's second-in-command and the cartel's chief logistics officer for North American operations. The agents bagged everything. Every single document, every server, every hard drive. This was evidence of something far worse than simple corruption. This was conspiracy. This was infiltration. This was organized crime operating from inside the federal bench itself. By 6:30 a.m., evidence teams had transported the seized servers to the FBI's Minneapolis Field Office Cyber Forensics Division, a secure facility on the 14th floor of a federal building in downtown Minneapolis. The room had reinforced walls, no windows, and a single entrance guarded by armed federal officers. 3 lead cyber analysts, Sarah Chun, Marcus Rodriguez, and James Whitmore, began the decryption process immediately. They worked in silence, fingers moving across keyboards, running specialized decryption algorithms designed by the NSA specifically for this kind of operation. The encryption on these servers was military grade. It would have taken a civilian team months to crack it, but the FBI had tools and expertise most civilians would never know existed. By 10:15 a.m., the first server yielded its secrets. What they found was a complete organizational chart for something codenamed Project Fortress America. It was not a cartel operation. It was worse. It was a permanent infrastructure designed to turn the state of Minnesota into a secured zone for drug trafficking, money laundering, and human trafficking operations. The chart showed Judge Thornfield and Judge Ashford at the apex. Below them were compromised law enforcement officials, 14 officers from the Minneapolis Police Department, 9 from St. Paul, and 7 from the Minnesota State Patrol. Below them was a network of criminal associates, logistics coordinators, money launderers, and street-level distributors. The entire structure was designed to operate as a shadow government, a parallel system of command and control. The money flows were revealed next. The analysts traced $4.8 billion in transactions across the previous 36 months. The money moved through shell companies, cryptocurrency wallets, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Malta, wire transfers disguised as legitimate business transactions, real estate purchases, construction company fronts, and restaurant chains. 37 shell corporations, 12 fake non-profit foundations, 16 restaurants and bars that were actually money laundering operations. The judges had not simply been taking bribes. They had been actively architecting the entire system. Judge Thornfield had been using his federal authority to dismiss or reduce sentences for cartel members and associates. Court records showed 17 cases over 22 years where he had issued suspiciously lenient rulings on major drug trafficking charges. In every single case, the defendant had clear connections to organized crime networks. He had systematically gutted prosecutions brought by honest federal attorneys. He had set free people who should have spent decades in federal penitentiaries. Judge Ashford had been even more active. He had been secretly communicating with cartel members using encrypted channels, tipping off operations about pending raids, providing advance warning of federal investigations, and altering judicial scheduling to ensure that cartel associates received judges sympathetic to their defense. In one case, he had personally helped arrange the dismissal of a human trafficking case involving the forced prostitution of 43 women from Eastern Europe. The servers also contained a strategic plan. The document carried Judge Thornfield's digital signature embedded in the metadata. It outlined a 5-year expansion plan to turn Minnesota into the primary distribution hub for the Solaris cartel's North American operations. The plan projected that within 5 years, the cartel could move 200 tons of heroin annually through the state, generating approximately $3 billion in revenue, 70% of which would be recycled through the corrupted judicial and law enforcement apparatus. The analysts looked at each other. One of them whispered, "This is not corruption. This is command-level treason." By 4:30 a.m., exactly 25 hours after the initial breach, a command center had been established in a secure federal facility 30 miles outside Minneapolis. The room was filled with maps, monitors showing real-time surveillance feeds, and leadership from the FBI, DEA, ICE, DHS, and the Minnesota Attorney General's office. Federal authorities had identified 54 locations across the state connected to the cartel network and the judge's conspiracy. Warehouses, safe houses, money laundering operations, drug distribution hubs. The locations were marked on a digital map with red pulsing circles. They covered Minneapolis, St. Paul, Rochester, Duluth, and smaller towns scattered throughout the state. The operation was codenamed Fortress Collapse. At 5:15 a.m., the order came down. 3,000 federal agents had been mobilized, 47 SWAT teams, 12 Black Hawk helicopters equipped with fast rope insertion capabilities, 318 uniformed officers from state police and National Guard. U.S. Navy personnel were positioned at the port of Duluth to intercept incoming shipments. Border Patrol units had been mobilized along the Canadian border. B-52 bombers had been scrambled from a base in North Dakota and were authorized to conduct aerial reconnaissance and intimidation operations above major cartel strongholds. The scale was enormous. This was not a single raid. This was a coordinated military-style assault on an entire criminal network embedded inside a state. At 5:47 a.m., the simultaneous operations began. In downtown Minneapolis, a Black Hawk helicopter descended toward the roof of the Solaris Hotel, a five-star property that served as the cartel's operational headquarters. FBI agents rappelled down ropes, breached through the penthouse doors, and secured the floor in 90 seconds. They found Viktor Morozov in a private suite, along with 17 other cartel members and corrupt officials. Morozov tried to run but was tackled by agents before he reached the balcony. In South Minneapolis, a SWAT team breached a mansion in the upscale Edina neighborhood and seized $870 million in cash hidden inside walls, floors, and a custom-built safe room. The property belonged to a shell corporation controlled by Judge Ashford. Near the port of Duluth, 3 shipping containers were intercepted and opened to reveal 2.7 tons of cocaine and a sophisticated money-counting machine capable of processing $10,000 per minute. In St. Paul, at a warehouse supposedly storing agricultural equipment, agents discovered a human trafficking transit hub where 46 women and girls from Eastern Europe were being held. The facility also contained 3 tons of methamphetamine and detailed ledgers documenting 15 years of trafficking operations. The women were immediately provided medical attention and shelter. Across the state, in coordinated fashion, teams hit 14 separate drug distribution hubs within a 4-hour window. The seizures were staggering: 3.2 tons of heroin, 2.7 tons of cocaine, 1.9 tons of methamphetamine, over 2 million fentanyl pills, firearms, surveillance equipment, communication systems, and documents. Thousands and thousands of documents. In a warehouse near Rochester, agents found something that would become crucial evidence: a computer server that had not been discovered in the initial raids. On that server was a video recording made by Judge Thornfield 6 months earlier. In the video, he sat behind a desk and openly discussed his reasons for entering into conspiracy with the cartel. He spoke of financial pressure, of a daughter with a medical condition that required expensive treatment, of gambling debts, of a business failure, of desperation. He spoke of being approached by representatives of the Solaris cartel who had offered him $5 million to provide judicial cooperation. He accepted. And once he accepted, he was trapped. They had compromises on him. They had photographs. They had recordings. They owned him. He also spoke of Judge Ashford, of bringing him into the conspiracy, of how they worked together to systematically gut prosecutions, of how they laughed about it in private chambers, of how the money kept flowing and the system kept working and nobody had any idea what was happening right above their heads in the federal courthouse. It was a confession, not to authorities, but to himself, a digital monument to his own corruption. By mid-afternoon on February 15th, the focus shifted to law enforcement itself. Evidence teams were now examining the seized documents and digital files more carefully, cross-referencing them against patrol records, traffic stops, raid schedules, and internal police communications. What they found was devastating. The cartel's infiltration extended far deeper than just 2 judges. 14 Minneapolis police officers had been on the cartel payroll. Their jobs were simple: provide advance warning of federal investigations, falsify patrol reports in neighborhoods where cartel warehouses operated, conduct traffic stops against informants and witnesses, share information about pending raids. The payments ranged from $5,000 per month for low-level officers to $70,000 per month for a detective sergeant named Thomas Reeves who had been directly coordinating cartel security operations. 9 St. Paul officers, 7 Minnesota State Patrol troopers, a customs official at the port of Duluth, an assistant U.S. attorney named Michael Brennan who had actually been working to reduce sentences for cartel members and block federal prosecutions. In total, federal investigators identified 38 law enforcement officials who had been corrupted. Some had been bribed, others had been blackmailed, a few had been threatened with violence against their families. The interrogations began in the afternoon. A detective named James Morrison broke down within 3 hours. He had been taking bribes for 8 years. He had warned about at least 40 federal agents about pending raids. He had helped the cartel relocate shipments before law enforcement could seize them. He had done it because his daughter had leukemia and the medical bills were crushing him. The cartel had approached him and simply said they would pay for her treatment. They kept their word. His daughter was in remission, and he was now facing federal charges that carried a mandatory 30-year prison sentence. The emotional toll on the Minneapolis Police Department was immediate and catastrophic. Honest officers who had been working for years to combat the cartel, who had lost partners to violence, who had seen neighborhoods destroyed by heroin, those officers were now learning that their own chain of command had been compromised at the highest levels. Captain David Young, who had been leading the narcotics task force for the Minneapolis PD, gave a statement to federal investigators that was later released to the press. His voice was hollow. He said, "I spent 22 years believing I was part of something that meant something. I believed that the badge stood for something. I believed that the system worked. And now I'm learning that above me, around me, the system was already dead. I was walking inside a corpse. As federal investigators dug deeper into the cartel's digital infrastructure, they began seeing connections to organized crime operations in 12 other states. The Solaris cartel's operation extended far beyond the Twin Cities. It was a continental network. Through Minnesota, the cartel had been moving approximately 70 tons of narcotics per month through a supply chain that stretched from Vancouver, Canada down through the Midwest to Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. The route was sophisticated. Shipments moved through trucking companies that appeared legitimate on paper but were actually front operations. Logistics companies run by cartel associates would coordinate the movement. Way stations had been mysteriously closed for maintenance at exactly the times when cartel convoys needed to pass. Border crossings had been manipulated. Shipping manifests had been altered with the help of customs officials. The human trafficking component was equally extensive. Over the 36-month period documented by the seized servers, the network had trafficked an estimated 842 women and girls from Eastern Europe into forced prostitution, forced labor, and organ harvesting operations. The women were transported through Minnesota and then distributed to brothels and labor camps across 14 states. The money laundering operation was designed with stunning sophistication. Dirty money would enter the system through currency exchange services, cash-intensive businesses like restaurants and casinos, and cryptocurrency transactions. It would then be moved through real estate purchases, construction companies, and charitable foundations. By the time the money had cycled through the system, it appeared completely legitimate. Federal investigators estimated that the cartel had successfully laundered over $9 billion through this network over a 5-year period. Federal authorities discovered that the judges had been planning an even more ambitious expansion. Documents showed that the cartel was preparing to establish permanent political influence by attempting to place sympathetic candidates into the Minnesota state legislature. The plan had names attached: 4 state senators, 7 state representatives. The goal was to create a permanent political apparatus that would shield cartel operations for decades. This was not organized crime. This was organized state capture. This was an attempt to turn government itself into a criminal enterprise. In the weeks following the initial arrests, federal authorities made a grim accounting of what had been lost. The Minnesota Department of Public Health released data showing that the Solaris cartel's heroin distribution network had been responsible for at least 3,074 overdose deaths across Minnesota and connected states over a 5-year period. 3,074 human beings. Mothers, fathers, children, young people with their entire lives ahead of them, dead because federal judges had decided that a bribe was worth more than human life. Neighborhoods in North Minneapolis that had been ravaged by the drug trade showed early signs of stabilization within weeks of the cartel's dismantling. Overdose calls dropped. Street corner dealers disappeared. Hospital admission rates for drug-related injuries declined sharply. It took the removal of one criminal network to show how thoroughly that network had poisoned an entire community. The families of victims began coming forward. A woman named Rachel Torres, whose 17-year-old son had died of a fentanyl overdose, gave a statement. "My son bought what he thought was a pain pill. He took it once. He died. And now I learned that there were federal judges taking bribes to keep the poison flowing. They had the power to stop it. They chose money instead. They chose money over my son's life." This is what institutional corruption looks like when it reaches the highest levels. It does not always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it whispers. It works through systems. It hides behind authority and robes and legitimacy. Power does not always need armies or bombs. Sometimes power only needs silence. It only needs ambitious people willing to trade their oath for a briefcase full of cash. It only needs good people who look away because they do not want to see what is happening right in front of them. Federal prosecutors had secured indictments against 81 individuals. Judge Marcus Thornfield and Judge David Ashford were both convicted in federal court of racketeering, conspiracy, drug trafficking, money laundering, and human trafficking. They were sentenced to concurrent sentences of 75 years each. The presiding judge, a judge not connected to the conspiracy, spoke directly to both men before sentencing. He said, "You were given a position of extraordinary trust and authority. The Constitution of the United States depends on judges who will faithfully uphold the law. Instead, you became instruments of organized crime. You sold your honor. You sold your oath. And in doing so, you allowed thousands of people to suffer and die. There is no sentence long enough for what you have done." Viktor Morozov, the Solaris cartel lieutenant, was similarly convicted and sentenced to 85 years. 17 other cartel members received sentences ranging from 20 years to life. Of the law enforcement officers who were compromised, 14 pleaded guilty to federal charges. 8 others attempted to fight their cases but were eventually convicted. Most received sentences between 15 and 30 years, though a few cooperated extensively with federal authorities and received reduced sentences in the 5 to 10-year range. The system had been broken, but it was being rebuilt. New protocols were established for judicial oversight, random audits of judicial voting patterns, increased financial scrutiny of judges' personal accounts, regular review of sentences to identify patterns of leniency that might indicate corruption. The FBI established a new division dedicated specifically to identifying corruption within law enforcement and the judiciary. The Minneapolis Police Department underwent a comprehensive internal investigation and restructuring that took 8 months. 3 commanders and 6 senior officers were forced to resign or retire early for their knowledge of suspicious activities and failure to report them. The message had to be clear. Silence was complicity. Looking away was a choice. But here is what must be understood. This story, as dramatic as it is, as shocking as the specific details are, represents something that plays out in variations across this entire nation. Organized crime does not have to be loud to be devastating. It does not have to announce itself. It works through the smallest corruptions first. A single payment, a single favor, then another, until the person doing it is so deep that they cannot escape even if they wanted to. The Solaris cartel's operation in Minnesota cost lives. It destroyed families. It poisoned neighborhoods. It corrupted the most fundamental institutions of justice and law enforcement. And it did all of this while operating behind the legitimacy of the law itself. The judges who were supposed to be guardians of justice had become instruments of exploitation. This is a warning about what happens when power finds its way into the wrong hands. When ambition overcomes principle. When fear replaces courage. When silence replaces accountability. The federal agents who conducted these raids, who risked their lives to execute these operations, who worked through the night to decrypt the evidence and expose the conspiracy, those people were part of what the system is supposed to be. They were the people willing to stand up and say no. Not this. Not in our community. Not under our watch. The work is not finished. Organized crime continues to evolve. Corruption continues to find new ways to embed itself in systems of power. This story from Minnesota is one story. There are dozens of others unfolding right now in cities and towns across this country. In some places, the corruption has already taken root deeper than anyone realizes. If you are still watching, if this story has moved you, share it. Demand accountability. Support the federal agents and law enforcement officers who are willing to stand against organized crime. Watch your own local systems. Ask questions about your judges, your police leadership, your elected officials. Demand transparency. Demand integrity. This is a fictional dramatization created for storytelling purposes. The characters, judges, and specific details are invented. But the threat is real. The potential for organized crime to infiltrate institutions is real. And the need for vigilance is real. The story of Minnesota shows what happens when that vigilance fails. It also shows what happens when people finally decide to fight back.